Hey guys, we are talking tensors. Let's continue. When we considered the introduction of the field of tensor, luckily for us is stemmed out of materials research, particularly the analysis that has to do with crystalline material wherein the atoms are regularly arranged. Now often when you want to bring in mathematical techniques and when you want to talk about its relevance to the materials engineering or the field of materials research, we have to bring in appropriate examples. And fortunately for us, as far as the tensor goes, all we have to look is the history of tensor. And the birth of tensor is essentially from the field of materials research. So that is something that we can be proud of. Now, when you consider the derivation or the way we arrived at the tensor, I don't know if it is appropriate to call as the discovery of tensor or the invention of tensor, because it's a long-standing debate whether the math is discovered or invented, but still, when you consider how the tensor was introduced to us, it was rather in a physical context. It was not an abstract mathematical entity, a mathematical parameter. It was rather introduced in a physical context. People were trying to relate two vectors. Each of these vectors have physical meaning to them. One was a load, the other was an area. And when they wanted to relate to these two vectors living in their own space, meaning they have their own significance apart from all the mathematical descriptions of the spaces, when we want to bring these two together, we ended up having a new entity which we called as a stress, which we gave a meaning as a stress. And when we wanted to numerically express the stress, it demanded two indices. Now, in the previous lecture, we saw that each of these index, they have a physical meaning to it. When you consider the atomistic scale, the regular arrangement of the atoms, which can be represented in the unit cell, each of these indices, they have assumed a specific meaning. One of the index assumed the meaning of the plane, or it described the plane, and the other index, it described the direction along which we are considering. So why do we need these two different indices? Primarily because depending on the plane and the direction that you are considering, the resistance offered, the stress offered by the material is going to vary. And therefore, we need to have, for a comprehensive discussion of the stress, we need to have two different entities. This demand for having two different entities is not confined to the atomistic scale alone. We also saw that in the macroscopic scale. When your continuum, when your large material, that is macroscopic in nature, which we can observe through our eye, when it is experiencing load in various directions, in order to describe this load in a way it is possible for us to handle it, to analyze it, to play around with it, we have to resolve it into different directions. We resolve it into its different components. And when we want to resolve it into different components, we have to resolve it with respect to a given plane and a direction. And this plane assumes or is represented by the first index, and the direction is represented by the other index. The reason why we want to represent or resolve the imposed load in an arbitrary direction to that of a specific direction in a plane is because when we are able to resolve it, then it becomes possible for us to categorize a set of load as a normal load or a normal stress, and a set of stress rather as a tangential load or a shear stress. So this makes us understanding the load experienced by the material, the stress experienced by the material on the macroscopic scale, but easier. So essentially, be it in the atomistic scale or be it in the macroscopic scale, when I want to describe the mechanical condition, the stress experienced by my material or the atoms of my material, it is required that I use two indices, and these two indices have physical significance to them in addition to the entire parameter that I'm describing as a physical significance. Now, one aspect we need to also consider is that the physical meaning of these indices stem from the frame of reference. Now, if you could recollect the original introduction of the tensor, even though the tensor had a physical meaning, we refer to this as stress because it is relating our load and our area. We are bringing in two different spaces and creating a new space, and this space we can call it as stress. It has a wonderful physical meaning to it, and this characteristically require two indices. All that is well and good, but under beneath this is that the quantity that is described by these two indices essentially stem out of the coordinate system associated with the original two spaces. Let me repeat. even though we bring in two spaces to form a third space that we call as a stress and use two index to represent the space, the relation between the two index, the meaning comes from rather the frames of reference associated with the original space of the vectors. So what it essentially means to us in this context is that the meaning for these indices, even though I can say that the first index represents my plane, the second index represents my direction, that's well and good, everybody can understand it. The meaning only comes, it makes a sense to me that I'm able to describe my plane using an index and the direction using another index. It makes sense to me only when I assume that I'm discussing all this with respect to a frame of reference. So all these indexes, even though conceptually I can allude this to a plane and the direction, the value assumed by these indices makes sense only when we have a frame of reference implicitly assumed. So what it essentially means is, when I describe a tensor with respect to a set of indices, a stress tensor in this particular unit cell using a couple of indices, the indices, by virtue of assigning value to these indices, I'm essentially fixing my frame of reference. This, what we have done for this atomistic scale, also extends to that of the macroscopic scale. When I resolve my load to its different components, and all these components I'm describing it using two index, so what I'm essentially doing is, or what I'm implicitly assuming is that I have fixed my frame of reference. Now, when I consider all these components of stresses, I can write it in this form, and I can rather rephrase it something like this, which becomes more elegant, giving me the tensor representation of my stress. Now in this case, it is rather straightforward for me to understand the relevance of frame of reference, because all that we have done is we have described our indices as x, y and z. So the meaning of this x, y and z is rather explicit because these x, y and z are associated with the frames of reference. Even if we write our indices as 1, 1, 1, 2 and 1, 3, even if we replace our x's with 1, our y's with 2 and our z's with 3, the meaning for this 1, 2 and 3 still stems out of the frame of reference. When the frame of reference changes, the meaning, the values assumed by these components of stresses will correspondingly change. So what we essentially mean by that is, yes, stress tensor gives me a new space wherein I'm able to handle my load and area in a single context. It requires two index, wonderful. It is a new field in mathematics, wonderful. But what implicitly is hidden so far into this is all these indices get their meaning from the frame of reference that we have assumed. Now, when the stress is rather the load experienced by the material per unit area, the response offered by the material to the imposed stress is expressed or described as strain. And then the stress can be resolved into these many components, meaning the stress experienced by a material in a given plane and a given direction is different from that of another plane and another direction. The response offered by the material, the way it responds to this different stress is going to be relevant or in relation to that of the stress in a given plane in that direction. So therefore, when we are expressing the response in the form of a strain, a comprehensive representation of that response would also be in the tensorial form. So even though it is possible for me to both represent the condition that I'm exposing the material to and the response of a material using this tensor notation, which demands two indices, and even if I'm able to write or hide the frames of reference or alluding to the frame of reference by replacing my x, y and z with 1, 2 and 3, still the meaning of these 1s and 2s and 3s come out of the frame of reference which I have assumed. To put it in a different way, if I want to talk about the stress-strain relation or the linear stress-strain relation within the elastic region, so meaning I'm loading my material, I'm loading it to certain extent wherein when I just unload my material is going to go back to its original shape, the transformation or the change is rather reversible. Even in this context, the relationship holds true only when there is a meaning to these indices, only when I'm able to relate one stress to that of one component of stress to that of a relevant component of strain. And this is possible only when I fix my frame of reference. Meaning, all the indices, they assume a specific value only when my frame of reference is fixed. When I assume this frame of reference here, my stresses and my strains assume a specific value. On the other hand, when I have a different frame of reference, my values of my stresses, the different components of the stresses is going to change, and correspondingly the value of my different components of strain begins to change. So essentially, even though we are comfortably able to attribute meanings to the overall stress tensor and the individual indices associated with it, all these definitions, all these meanings depend on the frames of reference. When the frame of reference changes, the value assumed by these components of stresses, they are going to change. Now, a wonderful question arises, or rather a reasonable question arises. Should I have to consider different frames of reference in a given material? My material can be, let's say, a block of iron. Why not go ahead with considering the most simple frame of reference and then be done with it? Why should I be worried about considering two different frames of reference? All that I'm doing is studying a material, a block of material. Even if it is not a block, I'm going to chop off a block from this material, and I'm going to describe a frame of reference that is conducive of this block that I have before me. Why should I be worried about another frame of reference? Why should I bother about having another frame of reference which is going to ultimately change the value of my different components, be it strain or be it stress? So that is rather a reasonable question to ask. Is it rather relevant for me in the context of material research to consider the different frames of reference within the framework of a single material? Now, unfortunately, even though for the introduction or for the easier discussions, a single frame of reference is sufficient, when we move ahead and get into the real life, the continuum of a material is generally brought about, is generally created by combinations by several nucleus. So when I want to establish a continuum, the continuum is, particularly the continuum which is employed in an engineering application, is rarely completely homogeneous. What it essentially involves, or what it essentially comprises of it, a growth nuclei that was rather the seed of this continuum that we see. So be it a solid state transformation or be it solidification, the continuum that you see before you, it would have begun through some seeds. These seeds which we refer to as nuclei. These nuclei grow at different positions and they impinge with one another and ultimately render a continuum like this. So this is something that happens or what is described here is what happens during a solid state transformation. The same happens during the solidification as well. In solidification, it's more easy for us to rather conceive. For instance, when you bring down a molten metal to a temperature that is well below its melting point, these different nuclei, they begin to form. The stable nuclei, they begin to form. One interesting aspect of these nuclei is that each of these nuclei, they have atoms arranged in their own directions. The atoms that are arranged in these nuclei, they follow their own specific orientation. Now, if I want to introduce a frame of reference to this nuclei here, it is easy for me to introduce a frame of reference like this. For this nuclei here, I can introduce a frame of reference like this. And for this nuclei here, I can introduce a frame of reference for this, like this. So, when I consider a solidification of a metal, and particularly the initial stage of it, I can observe several nuclei, and these several nuclei, they come up with their own frames of reference. And when I allow these nuclei to grow, the orientation of the atoms as the nuclei grow, they remain conserved. They are not going to change. For the whatever orientation that I introduced for a nuclei before is going to get carried away to the next time step. As they grow and evolve and establish a continuum, they are going to carry with them the same orientation, their same axis, the same frame of reference that was originally attributed to them in the initial state. Meaning, even after growing, even after establishing a continuum, these nuclei, they have their own arrangement of the atoms, and correspondingly, when you fix your frames of reference based on the arrangement of the atoms, each of these grown nuclei will have their own frame of reference. These grown nuclei is what we refer to as the grains. So essentially the grains difference, the difference between the grains is the orientation of the atoms. So depending on the orientation of the atoms, when you fix the frame of reference, you are going to have more than one frame of reference in a given material. So essentially what it means is when your material has 1000 grains, you are going to talk about 1000 different frames of reference. So even though the tensor representation or comprehensive representation, you are able to make sense out of each of these indices that are involved, each of the components of the stresses that are involved. That is so well and good. We need to understand that the meaning of these indices stems from the frames of reference. And unfortunately, in the continuum that is employed in the engineering application, we have this polycrystalline setup, meaning we have numerous grains that are associated with the continuum, and depending on each of these grains, the frame of reference is going to vary, meaning the values or the assumed by each of the stress in this chain components is going to vary because the indices are going to be, they are going to assume a different description to them. Let us take an example. Let us take this understanding and place it to an example. So ultimately, what you see here is, when you take this understanding and place it to an example, what you see here is a real life or a real crystalline material, a magnesium material or a magnesium alloy that is magnified. And what we are essentially seeing is, we are seeing the grains of this magnesium crystal, and on top of these grains, the unit cell is superimposed. Magnesium, SCP crystal structure, hexagonal close packed crystal structure. So what we are doing is we are superimposing the orientation of this unit cell. So superimposing the orientation, unit cell rather, and we are rotating in such a way that the crystallographic axis of the unit cell, it relates to the orientation of the atoms in that unit cell. So we take a magnesium alloy, we polish it, we get its microstructure. What we see is this alloy has too many grains associated with it. And in order to differentiate the orientation of the atoms in this grain to that of the orientation of the atoms in this grain, what we are doing is we are introducing, or we are representing the difference in the orientation by introducing the unit cell, by introducing the unit cell and then rotating it in relation to the orientation of the atoms. So we get a clear picture of how the different atoms are oriented in different grains. Now this is how a real life material would look like. This image, it is directly out of my master thesis. So when you take this, and the alloy that we used was a highly applicable one. When you take an alloy that is employed in a engineering setting, when you consider their microstructure, you would observe something like this. So this illustration here, what it depicts is, when you introduce your frame of reference based on your unit cell, so you introduce your crystallographic axis based on your unit cell, how the unit cell is oriented. As you can see, depending on the different grains, the orientation of your unit cell is going to vary, and correspondingly your crystallographic axis is going to vary. If you take this example and put it in a larger scale, if you consider it in the macroscopic material, you take a block of magnesium alloy like this, and you begin compressing it, we begin imposing a compressive load. As you can see, some areas are strained in a different way compared to another areas. So you can see significantly, or you can see there is a significant difference in the strain experienced by the different areas of this continuum. And this difference essentially stems from the difference in the orientation of the atoms. So what it essentially tells us is, even though these appear to be purely rather theoretical discussion of expressing stress using the indices, and these indices having meaning with respect to their frames of reference, as you can see here, even if I fix a common frame of reference for my block here, I go ahead with the morphology of this block here, and I fix a common frame of reference like this, wherein this direction talks about its length, this direction talk about its width, this direction talk about its size. Even if I come up with such an easy frame of reference, I say that okay, this is the only frame of reference I'm going to deal with. But when you look closely at the strain experienced by material, it is evident that this strain is not dependent on this frame of reference, because at this being this case, I'm going to experience a uniform strain. But unfortunately, this strain depends on my individual grains here. So it becomes rather important for me to consider my tensor in the context of varying frames of reference. Let me repeat, because my continuum is made up of different grains, and each of these grains are assumed, they come up with their own frames of reference, it becomes rather important for me to describe or talk about my stress tensor with respect to or in relation to these varying frames of reference. So this is not purely a mathematical concept, but it has a huge physical significance to it. Now, if there are 1000 frames of references and I have to describe my stress tensor accordingly, then ultimately I have to describe the stress experienced by this continuum here using 1000 different stress tensors. So I have to introduce 1000 different stress tensors to rather describe the stress experienced by this continuum here. Or I can do one other thing. I can build a tensor that is independent of the frame of reference. If I build such a tensor, that will allow me to rather describe the strain or stress experienced by the entire continuum using just one tensor. So what we are going to do is, because my indices, they assume meaning from the frame of reference, and since I have too many frame of reference in a continuum, we are going to move towards describing the tensor in such a way that the values and the meanings are not dependent on the overall frame of reference or the varying frame of reference. They are rather independent of it. So our goal is now describe the tensor that is independent of the frame of reference. So the objective of this lecture is to show that it is important for us, even while studying or doing materials research, to come up with a tensor that is independent of the frame of reference. So with that motivation, what we will do in the subsequent lecture is we will try to achieve or arrive at that objective. Goodbye, guys.